Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the second talk of 2025. I'm Nagar Okar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. Today, I am delighted to have Professor Christopher Platts, who is an assistant professor of art history at the University of Cincinnati, who is joining us today from Ohio, and he just won a teaching award called the Medieval Academy of America's CARA Award for Excellence in Teaching. But he's also an active curator, and he's going to share his insight on the about the most recent exhibition that he curated in the spring of 2024 on one of the most renowned women artists of Renaissance. Thank you so much, Professor Platts, for joining us today. I'm so happy to have you here with us, and I cannot wait for your presentation today.
Thank you so much, Nagar. I'm pleased to be here, and I'm grateful to the Medici Archive Project. I'm just going to share my...
Thank you.
All right. So the title of my presentation today is the same as an exhibition I co-curated last spring, Rediscovering Catharina van Hemessen's Scourging of Christ, Women Artists, Patrons, and Rulers in Renaissance Europe. And my talk today is a bit more informal. I don't have a scripted talk. I'm going to speak about the exhibition, speak about Catharina van Hemessen in this one painting that is in a private collection here in Cincinnati where I teach. And I'm eager to share with you not just our research on this painting, but how the painting itself served as an anchor for this small exhibition, focusing on the important roles of women from about 1400 to 1600. The rest of the objects in the exhibition were at our university, so I wanted this to be a way to really show off our collection and some of its strengths. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the slide to advance. Thank you, sorry for that. So really quickly, the aims for today, I'm going to introduce Catharina van Hemessen very briefly and talk about her little-known painting, The Scourging of Christ. And I want to use this painting as a springboard to explore not only her artistic concerns, but how she was especially resourceful in thinking about the human body and how to represent it at a time when, as a woman, she almost certainly would not have had access to men, for instance, in her father's workshop or other workshops where she could actually see physical bodies and study them in a way that artists throughout Europe and especially in Italy were already doing well before the 16th century. I want to discuss the exhibition, as I mentioned, its origins, the objects therein, and also some of the future related studies. And the last thing I want to say really quickly is that this exhibition, I relied on two co-curators, the art librarian at the University of Cincinnati, Elizabeth Meyer, and then a conservator, Mike Rezga, a private conservator in Cincinnati who used to be the head conservator of the Taft Art Museum. So some of what I present today is certainly their research. We all worked on the exhibition together, and some of the research I'll share. My own expertise is actually in 14th and 15th century Italian painting and manuscripts. So I beg your pardon and your forgiveness for any mistakes and oversights with regard to 16th century Flemish painting. And then I also want to say how much I've relied on the scholarship of various scholars on women artists and patrons in Europe in this period, including many affiliated with the Medici Archive Project. And so I'm grateful for the foundational research that's coming out of publications from those affiliated and others throughout the world. Briefly, Catharina van Hemessen was born in 1528, and she died after 1565. She's born in Antwerp. She was the daughter of Jan Sanders van Hemessen, a successful artist in Antwerp, also an art dealer. Catharina gets married to a prominent musician, composer, and organist, Christian de Maurienne. He's the organist of Antwerp Cathedral. That happens in 1554. In 1555, Catharina joins the entourage of Mary of Hungary, the governor of the Netherlands, and the queen, or the dowager queen of Hungary and Bohemia. And then she travels to Spain with her husband in that entourage of Mary of Hungary in 1556. I give you these dates because they play an important role with regard to the painting we'll discuss and where it lies within her catalog of works. Catharina has about a dozen signed works, and then perhaps 10 or 12 more attributed to her. Very few documents fill in aspects of her life. And then she's praised by Lodovico Guicciardini, the Italian historian of the Low Countries, and also by Giorgio Vasari in the second edition of his Lives. Both authors praise her, among other artists, Netherlandish artists, men and women, pretty much with just one or two sentences for Catharina. And I show you here on the right, her famous self-portrait of 1548. There are three other copies. This is the copy in Basel, but there are three others in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, in Cape Town, and then in unknown location. And I just have a quick detail in the upper left of the screen. The signature Ego Catharina de Hemessen me Pinxi. It's difficult to read, but it's 1548. And then she puts her own age, etate suae, 20. So her birth date we actually get not from a document in an archive, but rather from this painting or these copies of her self-portrait. What kinds of paintings did she produce? Mostly works like that on the right, a portrait of a woman in the Rijksmuseum. She specialized in small-scale portraits of men and women, sometimes individuals, sometimes pendants, husband and wife, and then sometimes pendants of siblings. And so in fact, her self-portrait here on the right, some scholars believe it was paired with a portrait Catharina did of her sister playing a virginal, though not all scholars agree. She made a few religious narrative paintings, like the carrying of the cross on the left. And the reason I show this is because the focus of our talk today, or at least the first focus, the Scourging of Christ, fits into this category of small narrative paintings, which Catharina did. And most of the works that we have from her are indeed signed by her. It's often hard to see. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but in the upper left of the carrying of the cross, she's signed the gateway in a formula that she often uses. She signs in Latin, gives her name and often the date, and sometimes mentions that she's the daughter of her father, Jan. The Scourging of Christ. This work is actually not very well known by scholars, mainly because the owner has not lent the work, and the owner is not well known. The picture on the left, which includes the modern frame, has a label that says down below, exhibited at the Detroit Institute of Arts. I think in the early to mid 20th century, it was exhibited there, and the collection, the owner at that time had his name, but the current owner is much more private with his work. And I think for that reason, it's only been loaned recently in the early 2000s to one exhibition in Belgium. And the two authors who have written monographs on Catharina van Hemessen, both written in 2004, while they include the work, they don't give much analysis. They give the wrong date. It's clear that they either haven't seen the work in person, maybe they didn't see it at the exhibition, or they didn't look at it very closely. They also comment on aspects like Christ's body in pretty pessimistic or negative terms. And so we'll talk more about this. I just wanted to share that the photos I have here, which aren't the greatest to begin with, still, like most works of art, they just simply don't do justice to seeing the work in person. So one detail on the left here, you see the flail or the kind of the whip of the flagellator on the right. And if you look at the picture on the right, the whole panel, you can see that you don't even see those thin wisps of the flail that catch the light. There are all kinds of wonderful details like this in the painting itself, whether it's the physiognomies of the figures or the articulation of Christ's anatomy throughout his body, legs, arms, and chest, that, again, you just can't see. The work itself is not much larger than a piece of paper. It's not much larger than 8 by 12 inches. And that's probably one of the reasons why the date and the signature have been misread, as we'll discuss. I want to mention briefly the origins of the exhibition. How did this come about? How did I happen to come upon this painting here in Cincinnati, which is not known. This area of the country in Ohio aren't really known for that many private collections that have early European paintings, Italian or Northern. When I first came to Cincinnati a couple years ago, right away I tried to find chemistry, geology, and other professors who were interested in the scientific study of art, an interest of my own. And so we started studying a few paintings in the Cincinnati Art Museum and the Taft Art Museum. And when some of our results were put on display at those museums or got a little bit of press in the local news, I received a phone call out of the blue from a conservator, one of the co-curators, Mike Resga, who said, I work for a private collector who has a Catharina van Hemessen painting. I'd love to look at it, study it scientifically with the pretty basic tools that you have to hand. So what you're looking at on the left here is just a screenshot of some of the results we have from doing X-ray fluorescence, thinking about the chemical composition of the pigments that Catharina used in all the little circles that you hopefully can see drawn into the painting. Our goal, our research group's goal when doing this technical analysis is to think about what pigments did she use? Did they differ from those of her father? And also, can we find any underdrawings under her painting using infrared reflectography? And so we've just started this, but we really wanted to look at this. We really wanted to think about this artist, male or female. She's the first to ever depict herself in the European tradition at an easel with her palette. And so we wanted to think about the very paints on her palette and if those actually matched the paints she used, whether in the Scourging of Christ or in her other paintings. That's something that's ongoing. We found that we needed new equipment, better equipment to do that. But I wanted to say that this was the origins of the exhibition insofar as us getting a chance to look at this painting that scholars really haven't had access to. Very briefly, I noted that just now, one of her few other religious narrative paintings on the left here, it's in a private collection. It's the Rest on the Flight into Egypt. You can see Joseph in the background there. This is currently on loan to the Moritz House, and they are starting to do technical studies. You can see an X-ray on the right that shows in the underpainting a donor with clasped hands who was shown originally praying to the Virgin and Child. Prior to that project, which hasn't produced any published results, the only technical examination of Catharina's paintings I could find were brief mentions in the National Gallery London's technical bulletin when they did large-scale studies of the material components of their Northern Renaissance paintings. So a very little bit about these two portraits by Catharina in London, just a few aspects of what binders she used. And the other reason that we were interested in this technical project is at the Cincinnati Art Museum, we have this wonderful altarpiece by Catharina's father and his workshop. Some scholars think that Catharina participated. This is the Tendia Readable. And so in Cincinnati, having this private collection, Scourging of Christ, and this large altarpiece, it has us excited to pursue this technical research once we get the right equipment and collaborators. I want to mention briefly before going into depth that Catharina most likely trained with her father, Jan van Hemessen. And here I show you two of his works. Many of his works focus on relatively close-up representations. In this case, religious scenes from Christ's Passion, where you can see Christ's anatomy. It's clear that Jan had an interest in the representation and articulation of musculature, rib cage, things like that, which Catharina picked up. Now, segueing from the technical study of Catharina to forming an exhibition about women artists, patrons, and rulers. Why did we do that? One of the things we noticed when we were doing our technical examination is the signature, which is in the upper left of the flagellation or the scourging, just to the left of the turban that Pilate wears. You can see, I hope, in the detail on the left, Catharina Filia Johannes, daughter of Jan de Hemessen, was painting this 1556. And so for the longest time, we thought about that last number, which other scholars had called 1555, 1552. And we realized they probably hadn't seen the work in person close up, but it's very clearly a 6. And I think that there is a little bit of that kind of grayish charcoal background that makes it look like it could have been a 5, but on closer examination, it's very clearly 1556. And I don't mean to make a mountain out of a molehill, but this is important when we think about Catharina's biography. Excuse me. First, I mentioned before that the 2 authors who have written monographs on Catharina have dated this work to 1555 or 1552. And then more recent authors, 3 authors in a recent collection from the early 2020s on Catharina as a court artist and on other early modern women court artists and early modern women painters have also not recognized that this painting dates to a period in Catharina's life when she's married and when she's in the entourage of Mary of Burgundy and when she is at court. And this is a big deal because some of those very essays are making points or major arguments about whether or not women artists stopped painting once they went to court. When they became ladies in waiting, they had used their painting skills, they had drawn attention to themselves, they'd gotten appointments, and then they painted no longer. But now that we have this painting properly dated to 1556, it's worth thinking about. And again, it's worth at least asking the questions, could Mary of Hungary have been the patron of this scourging of Christ? If indeed, as she is, Catharina is in Mary of Hungary's court at this time, could it have been for Mary of Hungary? She's clearly painting after she's married in 1554, which is an important point that goes against those recent essays about Catharina stopping painting once she's married. And so I want to hammer home the point that by redating the painting, it allows us to use the painting to go in 3 different directions. Catharina painted it, so we can talk about women artists in this exhibition. And then it's from 1556, and so there's now a chance that it was actually painted at the commission of or at the behest of Mary of Hungary. So we can think about women as patrons and women as rulers in the same period. So this work serves as the anchor for the other pieces that are in the exhibition. Really quickly, I show you Mary of Hungary. She served as governor of the Netherlands in the 1530s, 40s, and 50s. In 1555, she retires. She takes her court to Spain, not to Madrid, but to Castile, to Valladolid. And in her wake, or along with her, go Catharina and her husband, Christian, the famous organist. The exhibition was very small. And one of the reasons for that is that at the University of Cincinnati, we don't have a dedicated gallery. We don't have a library gallery space. So we fit the 10 objects tightly into this case that you see here in the art library itself. And I just show you this briefly because the left half of the case, and again, I'm sorry, I don't know if you can see my pointer or not, has Catharina's painting as well as prints and illustrated books by Albrecht Dürer, Andrea Vesalius, and Urs Graf, the Swiss printmaker. That constitutes the first part of the exhibition, thinking about Catharina's sources and artistic ingenuity when depicting Christ and the flagellator's anatomies and poses. And the right-hand side of the installation, using Boccaccio, a manuscript of Boccaccio that we have as a hinge, focuses on women patrons and women rulers, using autographed manuscripts, illuminated books, and other works of art to think about both Italian and Northern European commissioners and rulers. And Boccaccio as a hinge I'll discuss momentarily. So the first part, as I mentioned, women artists, we have Catharina herself and thinking about the Scourging of Christ. I'm going to show you a few images from a wonderful example of nun's work, Nonnenwerk. We have a circa 1400 manuscript painted by a nun from northern Germany. And then the Boccaccio that I'll show you, I've co-opted. It's not actually a copy of his famous women, but another of Boccaccio's books. And I use that portrait of Boccaccio to point towards his famous women, where he discussed certain artists, women artists, and their prominence. So the first part of the exhibition itself compares Catharina's Scourging of Christ to some of the sources that she might have used. Naturally, as I said before, she's not going to have access to a workshop where she could ask or see an assistant or someone pose with their shirt off so she could study the male anatomy when she's depicting Christ's naked body. That just doesn't seem realistic. It doesn't seem like a possibility, a logical possibility. So what does she turn to? Where does she turn when she wants to think about how to depict the male body? In this case, in the case of her Scourging of Christ, in a really unusual and interesting pose, there's torsion, there are limbs that are doing unnatural things like the arms that go behind the back. Just the idea of a tortured body against a column with its hair being pulled, it's very unnatural. And so one of the works we put in the exhibition was this wonderful print by Albrecht Dürer, his famous Mass of St. Gregory, where Christ himself, as the man of sorrows, emerges from the tomb altar before Gregory. And you can see, even though this Albrecht Dürer is some 3-4 decades earlier than Catharina's painting, his prints were wildly popular. Dürer was popular throughout the 16th century. There's a Dürer Renaissance at the end of the 16th century. And so it's not a reach to think that Catharina, through her father and through being in Antwerp, had access to Dürer's prints, which circulated widely, as we know. And so you can see Dürer, his own attention to Christ's chest and arms and legs, and focusing on the musculature. Similarly, Dürer, at the very end of his life, in the mid to late 1520s, and then he composes one of his theoretical treatises, his book on the symmetry of the human body. And it's published posthumously. It's translated right away into foreign languages, and it circulates widely. So I show here on the left, in our exhibition, we had a copy of this book. We had the Italian translation at our Medical Historical Library. So I'm showing you the Italian translation, but earlier in the 1530s and 40s, we have other translations that would have probably been available. Again, possible sources for Catharina. And here I'm not suggesting that we have definitive evidence, only that these are the kinds of things that as a woman artist interested in male anatomy, she could have accessed, looked at. And so I've shown you here one of Dürer's many studies in that book where he shows a male figure, frontal, also in profile, striding. Throughout the book, you have male, female, and child forms, not just frontal and profile, but also 3/4 in movement, standing, also steady. And so it's, again, a possible source. Where would a woman artist linked to her father's workshop, successful workshop, an art dealer himself, where could she have looked besides at her own father's paintings for inspiration? And the reason I'm looking for these other sources, the other leading painters in Antwerp, such as Quentin Matsys, at this time weren't as interested in the human anatomy as was, for instance, Jan van Hemessen or Catharina. So these printed resources, whether Albrecht Dürer's theoretical treatises or his individual prints, would have been possible sources. Another possible source, again, very contemporary with Catharina, was Andreas Vesalius's Fabrica, his treatise on the human body, the musculature, the bones, the different systems of the body. And in the exhibition, we didn't have an original copy from the 1540s, but rather an 18th century copy, very close, where we have a later Dutch artist who was very closely copying Jan Steven van Kalkar, who is thought to have worked in Titian's workshop when he did the original prints for Vesalius's Fabrica. And so we know that, for instance, the Habsburgs, like Charles V and others, had copies of Vesalius's book. And again, it's another possible source where one can think really about the anatomy, in this case, the blown open anatomy in this muscle man, so-called muscle man of Vesalius, when we're thinking of possible places for Catharina to turn for thinking about human anatomy. The other object we had in this first part of the exhibition offered a different kind of context for Catharina's Scourging of Christ. Here we took a print also in our UC Art Library collection by the Swiss artist Urs Graf. And so here we show Christ before Pilate, who's washing his hands. Urs Graf is an example of an artist who's not paying as much attention, who's not as concerned artistically or theoretically with the depiction of the human body. So you can see Christ here before Pilate, and so it serves as a foil for Albrecht Dürer and for Vesalius and others who were increasingly visually turning to the topography of the male body. The other reason we put this into the exhibition is we wanted to show the narrative moment just before the flagellation, just to give that context of Christ's passion. It's just after Pilate washes his hands that Christ is flagellated, is scourged. And so it offers that other view in terms of Christ's passion on Catharina's painting. And so I don't wish to suggest that there's a one-to-one correlation between any of those printed works and Catharina's work, but these are the types of resources she would have had to hand. And just casting a wide net, I found also one other example of a flagellation, this time by the German printmaker Hans Schöffelein. And again, we're about 3 or 4 decades before Catharina's painting and activity. But in this work you see on the right, here Christ himself is anatomically detailed. His head is turned down, not unlike in Catharina's work. You have a tormentor on the left who's pulling his hair, and you have a figure on the right who's kind of winding up with his head over his right shoulder, not unlike the figure in Catharina's work. If we were to look even further, I mean, Dürer did 3 flagellations in print. Lucas van Leyden, the other most famous printmakers in Northern Europe, also have interesting renditions. I want to move on from Catharina's work for a moment and discuss how it serves as this springboard for the other works in the show, all of which come from the University of Cincinnati's library collections. And so when we were turning from thinking about the technical examination of Catharina's painting to the major themes it could evoke, we just happened to be fortunate that the most important manuscripts and prints that we have in our very small collections from this period are by women artists, were made for women patrons or commissioners, or relate closely to famous women rulers. And so what I'm going to show you now are about 5 or 6 works that were also in the exhibition that illustrate these themes. One of the most enjoyable pieces to teach with is this circa 1400 German prayer book called Meditations and Orations. It's Northern German, and I'm showing you here 2 different pages in which a nun in this maroon robe is kneeling and praying before Jesus in a manger. And on the right-hand side, here she is praying before the Virgin suckling the Christ child. And this is a great example of Nonnenwerk, of work by a nun. This style of painting is clearly that by a female artist. It's not clear to me, or it's not clear if she's depicting herself or if she's depicting, for instance, one of her fellow nuns or perhaps the abbess of the community. But recently, a manuscript scholar came to look at this and suggested that its style related the work to Ebsdorf Monastery, which is a famous nunnery in Lower Saxony. And so this is a great example to teach students that, yes, indeed, in circa 1400, we have women artists who are creating works. And here you can actually hold an example. And there are 6 other miniatures in this book. Moving from women artists to women rulers and women commissioners, we put into the show our only illustrated Boccaccio manuscript at the University of Cincinnati. We didn't have his famous women, but what we do have is a wonderful early to mid 15th century Florentine manuscript of his on mountains and streams, his wonderful geographical encyclopedia. And so you see on the left, the frontispiece, the incipit, a miniature of mountains and streams and rivers and trees. And then inhabiting the initial S is Boccaccio himself with his book. Excuse me. So we put this in just for the sake of having a representation of Boccaccio, which would point us towards what was during his lifetime and soon after, arguably his most popular book on famous women. And in that book, he describes more than 100 women, including several artists from antiquity. Marcia, who you see on the right from a French Boccaccio, was one of the one of the Greek artists in ancient Rome that Pliny the Elder had written about under a different name. Boccaccio got the name wrong. But following Pliny in his natural history, Boccaccio lists some 6 women artists who were famous in antiquity. And so I just show you one, Marcia on the right, who paints her self-portrait from a mirror. You can see her palette, her brushes. This is common in scholarship on Catharina van Hemessen to evoke the 2 traditions she was probably thinking about. The tradition of St. Luke painting the Virgin, and then the tradition of Pliny the Elder and Boccaccio in their manuscripts showing women artists who are painting themselves. Another reference to throw in here, which we couldn't represent because we didn't have any early Christine de Pizan manuscripts, is to think about how in her book on the City of Ladies, she mentions that the most famous illuminators in France in the early 15th century in Paris, the capital of illumination, were women. But Boccaccio here serves as our hinge because he mentions both women artists and women rulers. So the second half of the exhibition, pointed to by Boccaccio, we've already mentioned Mary of Hungary and shown her portrait, and the idea that she could have been Catharina's patron. But putting that hypothesis or possibility aside, she was a great patron of music and of art. There are entire recent catalogs about her interests. And one of the things I hope to do for deeper research is to see if she had any particular interest in the scourging of Christ, in his passion in particular, so that I could potentially make that case for Catharina's work as commissioned by her. So we've seen Mary of Hungary. I want to show an example of an illuminated book that's definitely made for a middle or upper class French woman circa 1500. And then time permitting, I'll also go into the one Lucrezia Borgia document that we have in our collection, and then a print of Mary, the Duchess of Burgundy. And so here, thinking about women as collectors and patrons, as well as rulers in the same general period that we've been discussing so far. I show you just one opening from this book of hours that belongs to the University of Cincinnati's Archives and Rare Books. It's a particularly fine, circa 1500 book of hours from northern France. And what's most interesting about it is that other than having the typical hours of the Virgin, we have a very rare set of prayers and devotions. We have the Office of St. Anne. So what you're looking at here on the screen on the left-hand page, Incipit Officium Beatae Annae. So we're looking at the very beginning of the Office of St. Anne, and then the miniature that the artist has chosen, or that the scribe and patron have chosen, is St. Anne and St. Joachim kissing at the Golden Gate, the moment of the Virgin Mary's conception. And you'll recall that Anne and Joachim are unable to have a child. Anne is considered barren, but miraculously, thanks to God, she conceives the Virgin Mary. Now, the office of St. Anne was extremely rare in books of hours. And that office, followed by the office of the the Office of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin, which is also in this book, suggested to Roger Wick, the kind of an expert on books of hours and the curator at the Morgan Library, who very kindly helped with this particular book, that undoubtedly the patron of this manuscript was a woman, because including the Hours of St. Anne was really something that is only done by women who are interested in bearing a child, who are following in the footsteps of St. Anne herself, who was thought to be barren and then miraculously had the Virgin Mary. And so it's the inclusion of that office that points us to a woman patron. So even if we don't know a name, even if we don't have a representation of a female in prayer before a holy figure, as we sometimes do in books of hours, the very inclusion of this very unusual office gives us that evidence. Moving on to Lucrezia Borgia, we have a manuscript in our collection. It's a letter that Lucrezia has written, or perhaps more likely dictated. And here I haven't had a chance to look closely and to really research her handwriting, her script. But we have a letter from Lucrezia to one of her field commanders, Sir Ronaldo. It's dated 1515, October. And I'll read, or I'll discuss briefly the contents in a moment. And it actually came to the university with an interesting print that you see on the left. It's an 18th century print thought to be by this artist Paolo Fidanza, and again, allegedly after Titian. So these were on display as well in the exhibition. The letter itself concerns the movement of Spanish troops that Lucrezia Borgia and her field commanders are watching. This is kind of the close of one aspect of the Italian wars in 1516, when the Spanish are withdrawing. And Ferrara, where Lucrezia is Duchess, is allied with France and others. And so in the letter, she writes, Sir Ronaldo, yesterday we received the letter which you sent to me by courier. No response is required beyond thanking you for this notice. Because the Spanish are heading back to Spain, we need only to verify their progress, which will be enough. Send by the usual means, notice of their progress by courier is not necessary. We need not deploy cavalry since the situation is not as important as it first might have seemed. I should say thank you to my colleague in Cincinnati, John Brackett, our Renaissance professor emeritus, who kindly transcribed and translated kind of quickly, roughly, this document. But it's wonderful to be able to have something from Lucrezia Borgia. And I think I have a slide. Yeah, you can see a little bit more about the document itself. Our head of preservation lab had taken early modern letter folding courses. And so she made a facsimile that everyone at the gallery talks could manipulate. And so here in this picture, you can see some of the different aspects of the letter, how it was folded, Lucrezia's seal, which would have sealed it obviously for security. And so something that I'm not very familiar with, but I know those at the Medici Archive Project who work with documents all the time probably are, is the technology of sealing and folding letters, and the way it works is quite fascinating. The last figure I want to talk about from the exhibition, and I'll just do it briefly because I know I'm getting towards the end of my time. We had a print of Mary of Burgundy, and not to be confused with Mary of Hungary, the potential patron of Catharina van Hemessen. Mary of Burgundy, in the print on the left, it's a 17th century print, allegedly after a portrait no longer extant by Rogier van der Weyden. And Mary of Burgundy was, again, a major patron of the arts. Most famous, her most famous commission now is the Hours of Mary of Burgundy. And you see perhaps the most famous miniature from this early 1480s manuscript, where Mary is herself depicted with her prayer book, looking through a window at the Virgin and Child. But she was a major patron and collector of works of art. Her husband, the Duke of Burgundy, died unexpectedly in 1477. So for 5 years, she was in charge of arguably the wealthiest, kind of most high culture court in Europe. And so we included this portrait of her as well, that was a recent addition to our print collection. And so I just wanted to wrap up by sharing with you the examples of women artists, women patrons and collectors, and women rulers that we had in our exhibition, those three strands really coming out of this one painting, the one loan that we had in the exhibition, Catharina's Scourging of Christ, a work that, now that it's been redated, really deserves reconsideration. It flies in the face of some of those articles I mentioned, where Catharina is grouped with other women, early modern women artists who stopped painting once they got married, once they became ladies in waiting at court. But more than that, it deserves technical examination so we can think about Catharina's palette as opposed to that of her father. And then I really want to go into researching more of the devotional interests of Mary of Hungary in case this work of art could have been a commission from Mary herself. The date certainly coincides with when Catharine van Hemessen was in the entourage of Mary. That doesn't mean that she couldn't have worked for other patrons with Mary's permission, but it's something that I'd like to pursue further. But I'd also like to say that it's nice to have another narrative painting by Catharina van Hemessen kind of known to the public, or at least known better, because her production in that field of painting is less well known. At the same time, it's valuable to study for her own interests in the male body in a period when she couldn't really have studied the male body. And so that's one of the aspects that I was trying to get across with the comparative images earlier on. The last thing I'll say is that I'm happy to have created this exhibition, or co-curated the exhibition, because it let me use some of the highlights of our relatively small collections at the University of Cincinnati to focus on the really important theme of the roles of women in the early modern period. In the courses I teach on medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque art here in the Midwest, it's really eye-opening for the students, and I think also for my colleagues in art history, as well as other staff who come to see the exhibition, because we try to do a lot of outreach, gallery talks, things like that. And I'm glad that we have kind of the resources, and we have private collectors willing to lend a work like this that can anchor a small, tight exhibition on really important themes. And I'm very fortunate to have colleagues and great scholarship to draw on, especially from authors affiliated with the Medici Archive Project. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're also very grateful to have you today, who shared a lot of different insights into different aspects of this exhibition, not only the research aspect but also technical aspects, and even about lendings and all the complications of putting together an exhibition in this scale. So no wonder you won this teaching award. It was a very inaccessible, presentation, and intellectual as well as educational. So thank you so much. I truly enjoyed it. So with this, I would like to invite our audience to write their questions in the Q&A box so I can read them to Professor Platts. But if you don't mind, I'm going to start with my own questions. Thank you. It was very interesting, actually, to me that the exhibition not only looked at the roles for women as artists, collectors, and patrons, but also rulers, because most of the time, patronage and women in power as queens, or in the most the prime powers of a court, are looked at as a combined position, right? As a patron and a ruler. But this exhibition, at least to my knowledge, is one of the only ones that are distinguishing these two roles and addressing them separately. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate on this aspect of the exhibition, and how did the exhibition reflect on this?
Sure. No, that's a great question. And I have to say, part of it is a matter of convenience, which is to say that I was limited by the objects that I could draw on from the UC art collection. So in some cases, some of the women were just patrons. So there's the anonymous French woman who commissioned the Book of Hours. It's clearly middle or upper class, but not of the quality you'd expect of a female ruler in France, for instance. But when I was thinking about how to divide up the sections, I didn't intend to make a stark division between women as patrons and collectors and women as rulers, because, as you said, oftentimes women rulers were also patrons and collectors. So in the case of Mary of Burgundy, that last print I showed of the Duchess of Burgundy, she's an example of a ruler who was a great patron, commissioning manuscripts and also collecting paintings. So I don't necessarily want to say that there is a stark divide. It just happened based on the objects I put into the exhibition, based on the limitations of what I could draw on, that some of the objects, clearly female patronage, but not by rulers. With the case of Lucrezia Borgia, here's an example where I'm a little bit out of my element because I need to do more research, because we have lots of purported portraits of her and definite portraits of her. But again, I myself have not yet done enough research to think of her as an art, kind of what her commissions and her art collecting was. But that's just my own ignorance here, my own lack at this point. It's something I'd like to pursue. And then Mary of Hungary, there have been 2 large exhibitions with catalogs. She was really interested in music, but as well the visual arts. And so as Catharina's, I don't want to say patron right away because we don't have direct evidence that she commissioned artworks, but as someone who supported Catharina, brought her into her court, Mary of Hungary is an interesting case. And I very much hope, you know, as a scholar does, to find some bit of evidence when I get into the corpus of her commissioning of music and other things, to find something that perhaps she had a relic of related to the flagellation. Again, it's one can hope, and as one does the research, one hopes to find something that would help make a case that this painting we have might be a commission. So I don't wish to draw a strong distinction. It's just based on the objects I had in the exhibition. I think what you said is actually quite correct. We should often think of female rulers in a lot of cases as being those who probably did indeed commission or patronize artists or musicians. It just depends case by case. So
absolutely, yes, and I think, you know, part of my question was actually coming from this aspect that we usually don't think about, you know, women as rulers being something that can be addressed separately rather than being combined with patronage or even collectors. So I think that was very interesting. And thank you so much for your response. We actually have 2 questions by Tanya. Professor, I have a couple questions on your presentation. Firstly, with your wonderful technical study of the scourging, you were hoping to compare the palette that Catherine used to the palette in her Basel portrait. I was wondering if equivalent XRF and elemental analysis has been done on Basel portrait to determine the palette that was used to paint the palette.
that's a great question. I've looked in the literature as best I can, and I haven't found any actual studies that focus on Catharina van Hemessen's work. I've only reached out to a few curators. Actually, there's a new curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art of Northern Renaissance who wrote her dissertation on Jan van Hemessen. And I've reached out also to a few others, but I haven't reached out to the curators at Basel or at the Hermitage or in Cape Town, where the other versions of this famous self-portrait that are accepted as original or authentic are. It's kind of another stage. And here I have to admit my familiarity mostly with curators of Italian art throughout, those areas. But I feel like I need to do a bit more work and get a bit more equipment and colleagues here in the United States before I can make a good case to foreign curators before I do that. But I have only found that one current study of the Virgin and Child on the flight, the rest from the flight into Egypt, which is in the Mauritshuis, as an ongoing study. No results are published. The picture I had and the X-ray come from a website. So I have yet to find anything beyond a few mentions in National Gallery technical bulletin studies that give a few sentences. And I was really surprised by that. As for Jan van Hemessen, her father, there are a couple studies which would be useful for comparing. I mean, in all likelihood, being trained by her father, she probably used similar materials and techniques, but as she embarked on an independent career, maybe she made changes. And I think that would be interesting. Here, I would also rely on the help of colleagues who have focused more on Catharina's famous contemporaries, Lavinia Fontana, Sofonisba Anguissola, because I would like to know, and again, I haven't done the brief search, if technical studies have been done on their works in relation, for instance, to Prospero Fontana's work for Lavinia, or Sofonisba in relation to those she may have trained with, like Campi.
Thank you. And Tanya's second question is on any research that you might have done on Catharina's role in Mary of Hungary's court in Spain, as Mary was in retirement and moving her court close to her nephew, Philip II of Spain. Have you turned up anything regarding whether Catharina within Mary's court may have had any meaningful interactions with Philip and the Spanish Habsburg royal court?
I'm afraid that I haven't myself. I'm still at the point where I'm looking at those two recent catalogs that seem quite well researched. I should say again that my my current non-curatorial research is a book on a 14th century Venetian painter, and so my curating and the projects that I do often can diverge significantly based on what I have to hand. So most of so I haven't yet. I wish I could say I did, but I would look forward to seeing that from those scholars who I've been reading on Catharina herself. There are a couple good articles that make new cases. Like in 2023 and 24, I found some new ideas for why artists like Catharina and Lavinia and Sofonisba made so many self-portraits and their function, and making new ideas for their fathers in two of the cases. For instance, marketing their daughter's work, marketing the women as wonders of nature in the same way that Guicciardini and Vasari and others, including in Boccaccio's texts, talk about the fact that a woman who could create such a beautiful thing was in itself a wonder. And so there is some good scholarship in Spanish and elsewhere, but I myself haven't uncovered new things.
Thank you. But it was very impressive to learn that you only had one work on loan. Did you
Oh yeah,
mention
just
just
that
one?
one.
So it was really impressive to put together this exhibition with resources, local resources, and then having only one work, which was actually the highlight of the exhibition, but it was only one work on loan.
It would be wonderful if they donated the painting, but I don't know.
That would be beyond, real world. But the next question is by Polly. How would you compare Katerina with no workshop to Artemisia Gentileschi? And thank you for this wonderful presentation.
I didn't fully understand that one phrase. You said, how would
Either.
you compare Catherine with no workshop because she didn't have one? Is that what you mean?
I think so, because I'm a little confused too. Polly, if you could elaborate on your question, that would be great. But what I can read is that how would you compare Katerina with no workshop to Artemisia Gentileschi?
Um, I'm not exactly
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah, maybe we can Polly, if you could elaborate on your question, that would be great. So maybe we can go to Tanya's comment who says, thank you very much for your thoughtful answers. And I second that. Polly, we're still we still have a few minutes if you would like to expand your question, but I'm going to move forward with my other question that is about Katharina's access to anatomy of male body. It was interesting to learn about, using some, treatises on anatomy of male body, and that some suggestions about this kind of access. How do you think this idea and these documents can reflect broader trends in, generally women artists in the Renaissance having access to, live models for their paintings?
You've hit on a great question that I myself have, and I would love to ask your colleagues, the ones who are, the experts, and my colleagues on Lavinia and Sophie Nisba, because I have not read enough of the scholarship, and there's so much great work to know first, to think of the paintings that were executed by those two artists and those others, Barbara Longhi and others. I wonder if there are indeed representations of Christ's Passion that really focus on the male body, or other types of representations that might show a half-naked man. I'd love to ask those authors who know those artists best, if they did in fact paint very accurately the male body. Did they have access, whether in their father's workshop for Prospero Fontana? Did they ask a sibling or a friend if they could pose for them? That's your question is one that I myself have. So I definitely don't have an answer for you, but that's one I would love to know about, because I started to think of this issue. What was Catharina looking at besides her own father's paintings in Northern Europe? Because the other Northern European artists in Antwerp, where she was trained and raised, don't necessarily focus like Jan does on the body. And I mentioned only Quentin Matsys, but other than Durer's Prince, and then Vesalius actually thinking about human anatomy, it was just an issue that came to mind. And that's the next step, is to really turn to our famous Italian women artists of the same period and think about what they do, if they are in fact depicting the body in new ways. I know a little bit about the scholarship on Artemisia later on, and how scholars have focused on her ability to depict the female anatomy so realistically, and why that's important. But when it comes to the male anatomy in women artists, that's an issue that I need to do my research. So that's a good place to, begin consulting some of the scholars.
And keep us posted, please. So we have two more, although we only have 2 minutes. But the next one is by Andrea. Thank you very much for an intriguing talk. I have a question on the Mary of Burgundy, Mary of Hungary material. Could you please clarify the connection between Mary of Burgundy, 15th century, and Catharina van Hemessen, 16th century? I see the connection with Mary of Hungary as a supporter and possible patron of Catharina's, but less so Mary of Burgundy, who was her predecessor by a century. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I went too quickly. There is no direct connection between Catharina van Hemessen and Mary of Burgundy. In the overview of the entire exhibition, Mary of Burgundy is just one more example of a female ruler who was interested in the arts, who was a patron and a collector. She does not have any direct relation to Catharina van Hemessen. So Hemessen's Scourging of Christ is kind of the anchor for the exhibition, but there I take liberty to then go discuss women artists as different as a German nun from 1400, women commissioners like the owner of that illuminated prayer book, again, no connection to Catharina van Hemessen, and then Mary of Burgundy. So I take liberty to focus on those themes. So I'm sorry if I probably went too quickly. There isn't a connection between those two.
Andrea says now I understand. Thank you. And the last question is by Laura. Hi, Laura. Congratulations on a great project. What is known about Catharina inheriting the workshop models or drawings from her father, and whether she was able to bring this material and also the pigments she was used to work with from Antwerp to the court of Mary?
Great question. We don't know anything definitively because of the lack of documentation, but her father's style, many of his most famous paintings, many of his paintings are zoomed in. You saw just two very briefly, but they're in a style so different from Catharina's production. She does small portraits at about 3/4 length. It's thought that Antonis Moore, who's working in Antwerp when she's training, he develops this length of portrait. Maybe that inspired her. And then she does the small narratives like the Scourging. Those types of works have almost no place in her father's corpus catalog. And so even if we had some documents, I would be suspicious if Catharina actually made use of them. Clearly, she shares her father's interest in the male human anatomy, but her father didn't seem to paint many small-scale narratives. He zoomed in these kind of wonderfully detailed pictures. And so I think there's a lot of diversion in the sense that Catharina, like other women, like Sophonisba, like Lavinia, focuses on small scale portraits to an extent, and then she does these small narratives. So while she was most likely trained by her father, the genres, the subject matter, the types of paintings, and the scale and the drama therein are quite different between Catharina and her father, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor Platts, for answering our questions so patiently. We truly enjoyed your presentation and your talk, and this exhibition was really a valuable contribution to the field. So thank you so much for sharing your insight on this exhibition, and hope to have you again in the future. Thank you all for joining us today. I would like to invite all of you to our next week's talk by Professor Babette Bone. So please join us again, same time, same link. And I hope to see you again, Professor Platts, soon. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.